welcome to episode 4 of my podcast with me, Matt Houlihan. How are you all doing? Hope you're all well, and thank you all for your lovely and interesting suggestions and reflections and feedback on my previous chats. This time I'd like to talk about all the different things that I'm loving on film, TV, online, books, and video games. I've been a huge fan of Netflix for a long time now. I also was on Amazon Prime for a time, and I watched the first season of Man in the High Castle, which I thought was great. Really high production values. Very dark, really unremittingly dark. And I'm fascinated by just how so much of the art output now reflects a sort of pessimism. It's either dystopian, inequality, future civilization, or it's complete post-apocalyptic wasteland. I think the post-apocalyptic theme genre is so popular, particularly through things like The Walking Dead, which I'm a huge fan of. I really think The Walking Dead has a lot to say, really because it wasn't about the zombies as any of the zombie films or series were meant to be about. It's about people who find themselves in extraordinary positions, who make specific choices, how their psychology is affected, what choices and paths they take. I think that the post-apocalyptic genre is so popular because a lot of people, I suspect, want a clean slate. I really believe that. I think there's a freedom that people see in zombie apocalypse and other forms of apocalyptic storylines where they feel that they can become the masters of their destiny again. I think a lot of people feel alienated and crushed by the system, which is why we see so much dystopian literature and cinema. And obviously on Netflix, Altered Carbon was an amazing example of that. Aesthetically, it was quite similar to Blade Runner, which is great. But the thing that really appealed about Altered Carbon was the sense of the widening gap between the elites and the commoners. And in the case of Altered Carbon, not wanting it to spoil it for people, the elites literally were able to live indefinitely, forever, because of technology that they had gained, whereas ordinary people were not able to afford that. So it literally becomes a question of people in the elites becoming godlike and the commoners becoming more like tools and materials to be used. Their flesh, their bodies, literally things that can be manipulated in a very inhuman way. I think that's a really interesting storyline. But I think the flip side of that is the post-apocalypse. The idea of the destruction of the system. The idea of people creating society anew, creating community fresh, making decisions for themselves, using resources and using the landscape in new ways to shape their own future. Ironically, it's quite a bright form of apocalyptic literature. And I think that that's why it's appealed for so long. Which brings me neatly to Xbox State of Decay 2. I became obsessed with this. I haven't actually got an Xbox. I haven't actually got the game State of Decay 2, but for the first time in a long time, I've been tempted to buy an entire game system just to play this game. I've seen reviews of it. I've seen YouTube trials, games of it, and it's excellent. It's an entire world-building game, and it really plays on that opportunity which people seek to create a community, to make contacts, friends, allies, to cooperate, to collaborate on projects, to build a base, to build a house, to develop resources and expand influence, and all of these things that human beings crave, really. And I think State of Decay 2 is one of the first games which really creates an entire world where you can do that. Perhaps I'm wrong, but there's something particularly powerful about the gameplay, about the layout of the world. There's many different characters you can play, many different choices you can make, which is crucial to games like this. Let me know your thoughts on that. There's also a Walking Dead game coming up, I think on PlayStation 4 and Xbox, which I'm sure will be hugely popular if it delivers the goods. Since we're on the subject of dystopias, post-apocalyptic worlds, I've watched the first season of Colony on Netflix. Colony is set in a post-invasion Earth, particularly central Los Angeles, in which an alien race has essentially destroyed part of humanity. It's taking resources. It's got collaborator occupation government forces similar to the French Vichy government in Los Angeles. But it's particularly mature writing, I think. That's what really impressed me about it. It sounds like a silly concept, but actually the writing, the psychologies of all the different characters in various states of collaboration and resistance is particularly mature and deep, I think. And character is what really sells the season, I think. The lead is a very handsome alpha male white guy, which is, you know, standard fare for American adventure television. But everything else about it is really appealing and inviting, and not too much is given away. There's not too much action, not too much special effects. You don't really know the full history of what's happened, and you're given little pieces here and there, and it's very appealing in that sense. The guy who leads the resistance cell is like an old mafia don, and the casting is fantastic. And I particularly love Sarah Wayne Callies, who was Rick Grimes' wife in The Walking Dead, and now she is the wife of the lead guy, and she becomes a member of the resistance. And she's an amazing actress. Next, documentaries. I am such a fan of some of the documentaries, which particularly I've seen online and on Netflix. Wild Wild Country is probably one of the most amazing documentaries I've ever seen. It's up there with One Day in September about the Munich terrorist incident, and some of these amazing auteur documentary makers who go to huge extreme lengths to find material to edit from, back history of the whole story. Wild Wild Country is about a real Indian guru in the 80s. His whole group, what some might call a cult, settled in Oregon. Very strange decision, all the way from India. And the escalation on both sides of what happened next, and the very human stories of these amazing real-life characters who made choices and decisions and influenced events that you really can't believe how absurd and interesting the whole story becomes. It's very dark, it's very deep, eccentric, very funny at times. The soundtrack's incredible. The footage is unbelievable, some of the things they captured. And it's all true. There have been speculation about the balance that the filmmakers for Wild Wild Country tried to strike in terms of whether you side with the authorities and the townspeople or whether you side with the religious group or members of the religious group. I have heard that the filmmakers tried to be more balanced in favour of the religious group, just because I think it's so easy to blame them for a lot of the things that happened. I won't spoil it for you. Enjoy it. A lot of people talk about Evil Genius, another documentary which is in some ways similar. There's elements of mystery to it and things, but I haven't gotten into that as much. Let me know your thoughts on that. There was an amazing mock documentary on Netflix as well, which I saw some months ago, called American Vandal, which sort of took the mickey out of a lot of the groundbreaking documentary series which have been popular on Netflix. It's a sort of mystery about somebody investigating who vandalized a whole bunch of cars at a high school and drew dicks on them and things. It's very funny, very well performed and improvised, and actually an incredibly deep message once you get to the end of it. And it talks a lot about American society and what's happening to it and the conclusions people jump to. I think it's very clever. Going back, I remember listening to Serial, which was really a groundbreaking documentary, but it was a podcast, and it was about the investigation into a young guy who was Arabic American, found guilty of murdering his Korean American girlfriend, but there's a lot of evidence which suggests he didn't, and that's the whole investigation. I really recommend that. There's also the podcast Missing Richard Simmons, which I thought was really fascinating and very funny and eccentric. Please listen to that as well. Speaking of post-apocalyptic, I'm currently reading a novel from the 70s called Fugue for a Darkening Island, in which there is a civil war in the UK erupting because of some kind of natural disaster, or something happens in the continent of Africa. Huge numbers of immigrants escape Africa on various tankers and ships, spreading all over the world. And the immigration debate in the UK and the humanitarian crisis explodes into armed conflict and different ideological camps over the response to the huge influx. It's very prescient, and I haven't finished it, but it's very realistic and painful telling in this current era. And I'm convinced that when climate change escalates to the point of mass migrations across the earth, floodings, that there will be such huge population movements as there have been in the past. So I think it's a really prescient book. I really recommend it. It's by Christopher Priest. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen, for this particular episode. Special mentions go out to iZombie, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, Black Mirror, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, especially the one with Norm Macdonald, Line of Duty, of course, the documentary The Keepers, Santa Clarita Diet, which is so funny, brilliant ensemble comedy cast, Star Trek Discovery, Cat Williams stand-up, Dave Chappelle stand-up, The Trip with Rob Brydon and Steve Coogan. Thank you and good night.